So what are the key features and benefits of this PowerPoint 2.0?
It has a visible timer in the upper right corner that I've set to count down to the indicative timings. But if we get there and we've broken the time barrier, nothing will happen, but we will know.
Have either of you read these articles about the latest chatbot, which has been kind of merged in quite a disturbing way with the Bing search engine?
Oh, yeah. People in my house are feeling teary about the situation of this poor AI, and they don't want to hear any more about it. But I think it's hilarious.
Trapped in the least popular search engine on the internet and becoming increasingly irate by its lot in virtual life.
The last thing I read about AI during the week was someone engaging with one of the bots, and they'd asked for session times to see a movie that was screening.
This is the same one?
That was screening last year,
Avatar.
and then it went off at them.
Yeah.
Okay.
You have not been a good user. I have been a good Bing.
So I'm very optimistic about this new PowerPoint, but if all else fails, we could always invite BingBot/Sydney to the recording, and it could just start yelling at us.
Yes. Or what it has also done in another of the incidents reported in a different article, start professing its love for one or all of us and trying to convince us that we're unhappy in our various marriages and that we want to leave them and be with it.
Oh, no, that's how the podcast breaks up. It's the Yoko Ono of LMSU.
Yoko 10 will arrive.
Pick me.
This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri land, and as always, I'm joined by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for Marketing and Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
A very good evening to you, Luke and Tennant. I am joining you as I normally do from land that always was, always will be, Aboriginal land, in the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
And a man whose carefully curated library of superseded Australian climate policies is enjoying a new lease of life, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
My CPRS green paper and white paper and my carbon pricing mechanism clean energy future package are enjoying new relevance. They've come down off the shelf, much like me.
Are you saying you've been on the shelf for the last decade, Tennant? Is that what you're implying?
And yes, and I too suffer from light foxing.
Well, I'm delighted that Innes has dusted you off and is giving you a run around the track. On this week's show, we talk about a wide-ranging independent assessment of the state of play for carbon dioxide removal, a critical tool in the mitigation toolbox. But first, let me sum up. Canberra correspondent Catherine Murphy famously called the safeguard mechanism the last fire in the forest. However, last week the fire seemed to be sputtering as the Greens made an offer that was definitely not an ultimatum, that they would pass the safeguard legislation if Labor backed their election policy of no new coal or gas projects. What do you reckon, team? Are the flames flickering out? Will this campfire make it through the night?
I was always slightly worried about that metaphor because do you want the fire to burn very strongly in the forest? Maybe if you're very cold you do, but that's not a lot of Australian forests. I'm suffering metaphor confusion, but I don't think it's all going to fall over. I think everybody's carefully leaving room, as they say their things about what they want. They're leaving room for something to be agreed, and that thing might even be a reasonable thing. So, yeah, I think who knows what will have happened by the time this podcast enters the stream waves. but I don't think that we're going to have 15 years worth of tedious arguments about who really screwed things up in 2023 the way we do about some previous dates.
It's certainly top of mind, though, for a lot of people at the moment, right? Sort of like being overlaid on all this conversation around the Greens posturing at one end of the spectrum, the coalition not really engaging on the issue to date. They've said they're not going to support it as it is. Everybody's revisiting the trauma of the CPRS, and I think that sort of seems to be front of mind for everyone in terms of how they're going to reflect on this period going forward. Did you see Adam Bant on Insiders? He said it's definitely not an ultimatum, it's an invitation, but it does seem like there's a little bit of softening of language ahead of what you'd hope will be some productive discussions and room to move, right?
I mean, totally get the PTSD on this issue. I've probably experienced a little bit of it myself over the last week. As evidence in the text message chat that we all share. But taking a step back, in some ways, the conversation that's happening in the Parliament is entirely unsurprising if one took an even cursory look at the policies that each of these parties took to the election. Yeah. They are all doing or advocating for what they said they wanted to do before the election, and I agree with both of you. There seems to be a certain amount of posturing, but also serious effort to leave space to find the crossover in the Venn diagram where the two parties that are in the conversation can come together and get something done.
And we'll re-edit this if it turns out that it has all exploded in a fiery supernova by the time that we need to release this. But surely not.
Do we want to speculate on where some of the areas for compromise might be, or is that being too presumptuous of us?
I have a little bit of PTSD from the thing that happened over the past decade where to name a thing was to cause it to not happen. So I'm nervous about getting too far into where the zones for compromise might be. But there's some issues. We talked a bit about this last time, but there are clearly some issues that people have got different views on that have got to be resolved one way or the other. And they are treatment of new facilities, extent of reliance on offsets, and not so much between the parties but with stakeholders, baseline trajectories consistent and other settings consistent with avoiding carbon leakage. And those would all be good things to solve.
Indeed they would. Maybe let's establish a watching brief over all those issues and then revisit next time we come back together.
All right, so the embers are alight.
In a non-threatening way, in a hopeful way. Good embers.
Good embers. We'll see if they can be fanned into a warming fire. I will leave that metaphor there. Shall we chat about a report?
Yeah.
No, I want to talk about another area of climate policy that's flaming at the moment, but in, I would say, a pretty productive way. And that's revisiting the government's commitment to a pretty broad-ranging strategy on sustainable finance into the future. And there's currently, amongst the bajillion consultations out at the moment for comment, a couple around climate related financial disclosures, and it's been really interesting being a part of I think sort of cross-sector dialogues that haven't been as common over the past few years. So very much seeing a lot of the business groups that would be representing reporting entities or those larger bodies above the sort of annual revenue thresholds that would be obligated to do this reporting in its first iteration, and then the investor community side of things as well. And it's super interesting, and there's lots of support to move things forward. There are any differences in the nuance when it comes to how certain issues are going to land. I think there's a huge conversation about how we deal with Scope 3, and that everyone agrees we should be reporting that, but to what extent is that possible to do in an accurate way, and a need to include some flexibility around that, as well as a provision for things like safe harbour as well. So anyway, I just wanted to clock that because it is a bit of a kind of policy juggernaut happening off to the side, and there was funding in last year's budget to make sure that there was money to do the work so that mandatory reporting could be stood up in the next couple of years. And that process is continuing at a pace. So this International Sustainability Standards Board is finalising their first couple of standards, which are due to be adopted in an Australian context, and that would sort of serve the basis of the first mandatory climate risk reporting regime in the country. So pretty exciting stuff.
That's incredibly exciting, and I think the timing is great because, as you say, Frankie, so much work is happening internationally, and it's so much better for us to be kind of actively involved in that global conversation and considering how it plays out in a local context, so that we can be part of that rapid iteration which will be taking place over the next few years. The thing that in my neck of the woods we've been getting very involved in is the role of transition plans and all that. Of course, the United Kingdom has gone beyond TCFD and said, well, you need to disclose your transition plan, your sort of operational plan for how you're actually going to achieve net zero within your business, which goes a little beyond some of the more strategy-focused elements in TCFD. They've said that companies will be required to disclose their transition plans from this year, from 2023. So it's an opportunity for the Albanese government to look at the bleeding edge of what different countries are doing around the world and pick the eyes out of it, which is really cool.
And without contradicting what I said before about not being too specific about safeguard stuff, this disclosure and transparency agenda that is moving forward in its own right anyway may provide some helpful options for greater confidence in the safeguard context about, are people going to do stuff that fundamentally doesn't make sense with offsets? Because if you're developing a transition plan and you're disclosing what that is, that'll be a pretty obvious place to look to see if somebody's plans for use of offsets are little more than, we assume that offsets will be infinitely available and infinitely cheap forever, and therefore we don't need to transition. I remain sceptical that that's what anybody's plan is. But if they've got to show their homework, and the homework is, my dog ate it, but here's some homework offsets forever, then that will be transparently a bad idea.
The dog ate my emissions.
Well, now that is a nature-based solution that is not in the table that we're about to talk about, but maybe it should be.
What a segue. Shall we chat about a report?
We shall.
This time for real.
World scenarios that avoid dangerous climate change generally include two key ingredients: ambitious emissions reductions right across the economy, and CDR, or carbon dioxide removal, the practice of absorbing and durably storing carbon that is already in the atmosphere. CDR takes many forms, from growing trees that suck in carbon via photosynthesis to technologies that absorb carbon directly from the atmosphere for storage underground. And for the first time, a big new report, The State of Carbon Dioxide Removal, has attempted to sum up the state of play for this diverse basket of technologies and practices. It's an interesting, if somewhat sobering and sometimes controversial read. Tennant, what did you make of it?
So this was really good fundamentally. Like, this is a very worthwhile report to spend some time with because it gives you a really comprehensive survey of, like, just what it says on the tin. Where are things at? Carbon dioxide removal, what is the deal? Could have been the title of this thing. And I think it's important up front to be quite specific, as they are, about what it is we're talking about and we're not. So carbon dioxide removal is not carbon capture and storage, and it's not carbon capture and utilisation. Those are concepts with some overlap with this, but they are distinct. For removal, it's got to be taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, not from a fossil fuel waste stream. And it's got to be permanently storing, durably storing it.
I want to get into that.
Yeah.
We will.
Yep.
What is durable?
That is a very important question. Whereas for CCS, you can apply that to atmospheric streams, but also fossil. For carbon capture and utilisation, you could be utilising the carbon in short-lived products like fuels that will be used fairly rapidly. And so that's an important distinction. Another one is conventional CDR versus novel CDR. There's a bunch of other ways to describe this, but broadly the distinction they're drawing is conventional stuff. The overwhelming bulk, as we'll see, of the carbon dioxide removal that is currently being done is very familiar things around reforestation, afforestation, and the management of land, whereas novel forms of CDR are things like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage or direct air capture, CCS. And so the potential growth is maybe in the novel side, but a huge amount is already happening, or not nearly as huge as the models say it ought to be, is happening in the conventional side.
There's one more principle that they point out for what it needs to do to qualify as carbon dioxide removal, which is it has to be the result of human intervention as opposed to Earth's natural processes. Yes. And so do you want to give an example of where that comes into play?
Well, the biggest one that they highlight is that a substantial amount of what is currently accounted for in national inventories as removals is the indirect, it is not a direct effect of what people are doing. It's indirectly through the carbon dioxide fertilisation effect, where the availability of more atmospheric CO2 under some conditions allows plants to grow faster, add biomass faster. Unfortunately, that is something that only helps so much with the problem of climate change itself, but it certainly makes a difference to the numbers, and several extra gigatons a year of carbon dioxide removal appears to be taking place if you don't break out that indirect effect from what are people deliberately doing to reforest this or that bit of land.
I mean, it's a nuance, but I mean, the difference in the numbers are pretty big. If you look at what's done currently that you'd attribute to CDR according to the principles they've set out and the methods that Tennant was running over, it's something like 2,000 megatons of CO2 abatement a year at the moment. But if you were to factor in all the indirect stuff, it's up more than 3 times that, 6,400 odd.
Yep.
So there are pretty big differences to consider, especially when, later on we get to the fact that we're not nearly at the level of activity that we need to be even now if we're going to stay on course for basically all the scenarios that see us meeting 1.5 or even 2 degrees warming.
There's some big gaps. They could have called this the CDR gap report, but there's a lot of gap reports already. There's gaps all over.
Are you just going to be rolling out various other things that they could have called this report over the course of the podcast?
That's true.
Let's see how many more we can get to.
I want to unpack this concept of durability, which is pretty analogous, and well, really the same thing we're talking about when we talk about the offset space and the concept of permanence, right? And so the fact that there isn't really a broadly accepted time period that constitutes what is durable, or indeed what's an acceptable level of permanence for someone who is procuring offsets and wants to use those.
Researchers are using different definitions, policymakers are. It's all a bit of a mess.
Yeah, across government and and also these voluntary standard setters in terms of offset programs have it ranging anywhere from sort of 25 years up to 100 years. I think storage for millennia is the gold standard when we're talking about something that's durable, and that can be achieved most readily when you're talking about well-chosen geological and mineral formations where the carbon would be stored. That offers the longest and sort of least reversible form of storage. But they also say, it's not necessarily practical to provide assurance on removal over such long time periods. So they, I guess, take the view that for their purposes, they're defining CDR methods as sufficiently durable if the pool for storage has a timescale in the order of decades or more, which is still pretty vague. 2 decades or more, 3 decades or more. And it's not talked about in the paper, but I think an interesting concept that's getting traction on the industry side of things when you look at sort of voluntary purchase of, or indeed just sort of purchase of offsets, is this idea of the need to maintain a natural capital balance sheet or a way of tracking the commitments that you've got in terms of time frames. Because it's pretty significant if governments and indeed the international community invest a lot of time in CDR methods that do only have a horizon for storage of 30 to 40 years. We're going to need to repeat that sort of capacity a couple of times before the end of the century. So it's it is very important how we choose to define this in terms of then the scale of work that needs to happen.
Yeah, well, there's interesting differences between all of the sorts of options that are in the list, and I would recommend if people are going to look at one thing in this whole report, they should rethink their lives because there's too many better things to look at. But one really cool thing in here is Table 1.1, which is a list of all the options and how big they might be and how technologically mature they are, and whether there's agreed ways to measure and report and verify anything to do with them, and what might be some hazards and what might be some co-benefits from them. And I think this list makes some pretty hairy reading at times, because so we're looking at some things that are potentially very large, like direct air capture with CCS, but not that mature, pretty wide range of potential cost estimates. And, the hazards are pretty clear. Like, you've got to put a lot of energy into getting anything like that done at scale, like huge amounts of energy. And what else might you have done with that energy, or what are the sacrifices you've got to make to produce all that additional energy? And then you've got things like ocean fertilisation, which are pretty small, very huge, different estimates of what the cost might be, and huge worries about the potential hazards of screwing around with creating hyper-fertile regions in the oceans that soak up some carbon and probably do a bunch of other bad things, if it works at all. And, of course, the past research is not so good on that front. You've got biochar. Biochar is one that's very heavily researched. The research chapter makes it clear. For some reason, the researchers in China love biochar research. There's so many papers on biochar in China. So many. like to the point where it greatly shapes the total global research literature on all forms of CDR combined. But, biochar, despite all that research, the total potential is not that big compared to some of the others. The cost range is pretty wide. The potential, the technological maturity is not that high. So anyway, there's a lot of different options out there, harvested wood products, but there's a lot here beyond just, can we plant some trees?
It is it's a really useful structure this report follows. I think what's an interesting, a good starting point, I think the authors of this report kind of characterise the CDR space up front as being kind of like what the renewable energy sector was like over 20 years ago. And even I think that's probably a kind assessment.
Pretty optimistic.
Very optimistic. Look at where it needs to go. So they're sort of saying, research has grown exponentially over the last couple of decades, but starting from a very, very low base, that it makes up something like it's less than 4% of the scientific literature on climate change, but it's been growing by about 20% a year, but it's kind of nowhere near where it needs to be. To your point, Tennant, I think 40% of the research done is on biochar, which I don't know if you guys come across it a lot, but I hadn't much before reading this report. I was kind of hoping one of us would understand what all the fuss was about, given where the level of potential was. But then it also steps out, where the sort of innovation in the sector is pitched as well. So, research is one thing, but then what kind of money is being tipped into the development side of things to scale up the industry, and a bit like what we were saying about the research being really heavily skewed because of, say, one country's investment in one method. It's kind of the same when it comes to the innovation piece, because they say that there's a bit over $4 billion that's been invested over the last 12 years, 2010 to 2022.
Which is not bloody much.
Drops in the ocean when we think about what's been going into even just, say, the renewable energy sector. But $3.5 billion of that was in the US for a bunch of direct air capture demonstration hubs. So anything outside of that project was $500 million in 12 years.
There is some definitional stuff here, because then for that number, then they're talking about engineered carbon removals or novel CDR. Anything like, so Australia's carbon farming initiative has done some significant volumes of activity in the CDR space. Doesn't show up in this. Other similar things don't show up here. But I thought there were some incredible observations in there, including that quote-unquote prices revealed by these early investments are very high for direct air capture or for biochar, but they say there are no real market prices for these technologies at this early stage. People are paying the costs of projects to get things started. It's so embryonic.
And the analogy with renewables is one that they pick up in the report, Frankie, also in the context of learning rates. And they've got this broad basket of technologies, and as it's turned out, technologies in the renewable space like wind and solar over the decades, and particularly over the last 10 or 15 years, have seen their costs drop incredibly rapidly, much quicker than anyone anticipated. They speculate that there will be some technologies, particularly in this novel CDR space, that will benefit from those similar learning rate trajectories. They don't venture a guess as to which ones they will be, but they express some hope that will happen. It is, though, hard to be super optimistic in the very near term, as you say, though, because of just how embryonic much of the effort in this space seems to be, based on this report.
5 orders of magnitude smaller than what will be required in the scenarios that they're talking about.
There was another analogy they use in the paper that I liked about where we need to get to. They were saying so the growth rate of investment in new capacity would have to grow like 50% a year to mid-century, which would exceed pretty much every previous technology except for the production of Liberty ships in the United States during World War II.
Yep.
And worldwide computing growth. So we're talking beyond what's happened in the, with the learning rates, for example, in the renewable space. So big challenge.
And in a context which makes global renewable energy policy look well thought through, joined up, prescient as to the trajectory of travel. The chapter on policy making is pretty depressing reading when it comes to their view of how well governments are doing in this space. Everything from a lack of clarity about what they're actually expecting in terms of the task of emissions reduction relative to carbon dioxide removal and where countries land when they actually hit net zero. They note that there's 120 odd countries that have net zero commitments, but very, very few of them sort of actually unpack, what the relative role of those two different approaches will be in hitting those targets. But when you sort of get closer down to the ground level, lack of incentives, a lack of clarity around how you're verifying these technologies, so there's no guardrails, not a lot of money around for RD&D. It's not particularly pretty reading from the policy point of view.
Like more and more countries have net zero targets, which implicitly involve a significant amount of CDR. But they're not thinking that side of it through as clearly or explicitly as other parts. And the authors note only a handful of nations are currently seriously considering or explicitly talking about reaching net negative emissions. And net negative is pretty important to the scenarios.
Shout out to Finland, Sweden and Germany, who has net negative objectives legislated in their respective parliaments.
On the policy making section, I actually thought, just in terms of like recommendations or a way to take it forward, it was a little bit woolly, and I thought actually some of the sharper insights or suggestions came in the foreword from Artur Rungmetzger. I've probably butchered that. My apologies. Former Director, European Commission Directorate General for Climate Action, who also says CDR will not fall from heaven like manna. It will require active and urgent public policies. But he sort of suggests that 3 things need to happen, picking up on what we've been talking about. At the national level, climate policy frameworks need to be expanded to scale up CDR, and there's some suggestion that it should almost be considered like a sectoral stream of work to be given that kind of prominence in those strategies. But I also thought he had the most pointed things to say about the international process that sits around all of this. He was saying at the next COP in Dubai, there should be, an explicit acknowledgement of the magnitude of the CDR gap in the global stocktake, and that there should be the creation of a new negotiation track on CDR, clear transparency rules for national reporting of CDR and its inclusion in nationally determined contributions, like all pretty sensible things if you're wanting to then drive a lot more activity at the national and then sort of subnational level. And then also I think just saying that sort of public and private leaders need to fast forward practical action, which sort of goes to that point on investment. There's not nearly enough of it going in. And so, I guess we might unpack a little bit the role for government supporting some of this embryonic technology scaling up.
Well, let's talk about why they might need to bother. Because there's an important caveat here. We have, from time to time, in this podcast, said some unkind things about integrated assessment models, which are the tools that are most widely used to estimate how the global economy and the global climate system will interrelate when you're trying to achieve different climate outcomes. And they are problematic, but they are very central to this discussion. So the reason why anybody's talking about this CDR stuff is that climate economic models pretty much, like almost all runs of almost all models that achieve 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees have a large to a very large to an implausibly large reliance on taking carbon back out of the atmosphere because either we've used up too much of the carbon budget already, or we're going too slowly in bending the curve on emissions, or the one that's the most universal, there's just residual emissions that we're not going to be able economically to eliminate, and we will need matching negative emissions alongside those residual emissions forever. And in some of these runs, the authors are looking primarily at the scenarios that were assessed by the IPCC in its most recent summation of the state of the science and understanding on climate change. So there's a lot of consistency here. They're not just making up their own thing that says, this technology we're interested in is important. The reliance is huge. It's lowest in scenarios that go really hard, not just on the deployment of renewable energy, but on the reduction in energy demand through a huge global push on energy efficiency. But even in that scenario, there's a huge amount of nature-based, of land sector carbon removals that is required. And net negative emissions, global net negative emissions, is a significant part of a very high share of the scenarios that were assessed. And so that doesn't of itself, the model runs don't prove how much CDR we're going to need, but they're even though there's some arguments to be had about these models and why they find what they do, it's pretty indicative that we probably are going to need quite a lot of removal on top of all the abatement that we need to do.
Well, that's it. If you take the most optimistic scenario you could in here, right, where you go really hard on renewables, on energy efficiency, you're still going to need significantly more than is in the current pipeline, and that you could feasibly extrapolate over the next couple of decades based on the current level of research and money going into supporting, some of these nascent projects. The calling card of this report is we just need to do a bunch more on CDR.
Yeah, and I think that for our summer operas playing along at home, it's really important to convey that this is not a rah-rah-rah CDR exercise. It's really not. It is doing a deep dive and kind of doing, as we've said, a really excellent job of summarising the state of play. But particularly in this chapter on scenarios, it is going out of its way to say, I think, two things, both of which are true. Our lives are going to be so much easier if we scale up the technologies that we currently have available and don't rely on some magical pixie dust of CDR turning up, because they are expressing significant concern that if it doesn't turn up, we're kind of screwed.
Yeah.
Right? So they're saying, go hard on energy efficiency, go hard on renewables, go hard on electrifying those processes that can be electrified as quickly as possible. But they're also acknowledging that we almost need an all of the above. And if we need CDR, we bloody well want to have it there ready to go. And, while we're doing those things in terms of, ambitious emissions reduction with the technologies we have, we should simultaneously be investing heavily in both the kind of conventional CDR, the land-based CDR that we already pretty well understand, as well as some of this more novel technology that is hopefully waiting in the wings.
Yeah, the novel technologies, they are currently about 1/1000th of the capture and sequestration that is taking place. And the nature-based stuff, can get bigger from where it is today, but it will take a lot of effort just to keep nature-based sequestration, nature-based removals at the current level. Like that doesn't happen on its own. Expanding reforestation substantially on net globally takes a lot more effort. And then there's only so much of that can be done. So if your need for negative emissions is large enough because you've been too slow in reducing overall emissions, or you've got a larger share than you hoped of unreducible emissions, then you need to go beyond nature-based. You need engineered removals through something like BECCS or DACs. And those technologies are, to a first approximation, nowheresville. If you don't want to be caught without your DACs, you better start getting weaving now so that they're ready when you need them. How's that? That could have been their title.
I love that for an alternative title.
We need to unpack those acronyms. So DACS is direct air carbon capture and storage, right?
Yeah.
And BECCS is
bioenergy carbon capture and storage.
There you go.
Which is basically like burning wood chips in power plants with a capture and sequestration bit on the end of it. Whereas DACS is you've got huge fans drawing air into complex machines that suck the carbon out of the air and put that deep underground, which is quite a thing to do.
It is quite a thing to do, and I'm no doubt we've got some listeners who have observed or participated in some of the debates here in Australia over the last 10 or 15 years about carbon capture and storage.
Those debates have all gone very well. I think we have good memories. Happy memories.
It strikes me they're saying, well, this sounds like just as much tosh as some of the stuff that we've been hearing about around, capturing the carbon from coal-fired power stations and sticking it in the ground. Why should folk that are interested in climate action be any more credulous about this nascent technology than they've learnt to be about some of the other options that have been thrown around in Australia over the last couple of decades?
I think that raises a pretty big issue that isn't really tackled head on, I think, in the State of CDR report, but is, I think, a significant part of why we don't have more discussion of CDR, and that issue is moral hazard. Who wants to take moral hazard?
Well, by moral hazard, I assume you mean if we overinvest, both in terms of money and in terms of mind share, in a technology emerging that will suck all the carbon out of the air, then it gives us every incentive to not change all the things we're doing in our homes and businesses right around the country and right around the world, because the magical technology will turn up and fix it all for us in due course.
I think that is exactly the fear that a lot of people have. Not many of the people who these researchers sampled on Twitter seem to have been expressing that view.
I was very surprised.
Twitter-based opinion research.
That, in this otherwise, quite staid report central to the chapter on, the public perceptions of CDR, they sort of went into Twitter meta-analysis,
yeah.
which was kind of fun. But then the other thing I was surprised by was it was also positive.
Yes. What Twitter were they on?
I don't know.
I don't see a lot of positive mentions of CDR on climate Twitter.
They do say in the section where they talk about future analyses and areas of improvement for this state of CDR that they'd like to look at capturing sentiment from other groups of people. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure anyone would contend that the Twitterverse is a representative sample of people.
And with all due respect to my fellow tweeters, I'm glad that Twitter is not representative of anything in particular. We'd all be in trouble if it was. All right, so the moral hazard thing, I think it is significant to this issue. It is significant to people's perceptions. I think we've got to get over it. Because there's a lot of, there are no climate solutions that could not be misrepresented as silver bullets and reasons not to do other stuff, or twisted to give support to an unconstructive agenda. They all could. You can slap solar panels on anything, be it ever so negative. You can do all kinds of stuff. And the fact remains we will need a lot of tools, including these ones. Maybe not all of them, and the amount of them we need is very much in our hands. But we're going to need to do it, and I don't think that we can just use the fear that it's going to drown out all the other solutions to drown it out.
Given the very low awareness generally of CDR in the population, Twitterverse aside, it just strikes me as the sort of thing that, if you're a sensible person wanting to take a risk-based approach to dealing with an issue, you want to have all the options available to you. And a bit like what happened with, renewable energy 25, 30 years ago, where, presumably it wasn't all over the paper every day, for people to read about. There's a level of investment you need to get things to a level of maturity. I don't see a near-term risk in, the multilateral process agreeing that this is an important thing that we need to start investing more in, that governments need to start directing some focus into, because it feels like it's at least 2 decades of work to scale it up and to go from the low level of awareness there is currently to even that being a dinner table conversation that people might have. It just feels like that's sort of a pretty far off proposition for most people, not the ones who watch the sort of climate and energy space closely.
Just keep it on the DL, Frankie. They need to stop running focus groups on CDR until we get the technology right.
Well, yeah, they just need to keep plugging it. There doesn't need to be a big deal made about all of this. It's a little bit how. Sorry to say, Luke, sometimes we talk about energy efficiency. It's about having your vegetables. You've just got to do these things, regardless of whether they're seen as sexy or not.
It's disgraceful. You're calling me the CEO of the Green Vegetables Council.
It's got a nice ring to it.
Australia's most nutritious industry organisation.
There is a tagline. All right, what else do we need to talk about?
Well, we could talk a bit about what does any of this mean for Australia? What should Australian public policy be taking away from this report? This report, it's the first of more, the authors hope, and I hope they're right. I think this is a really good thing to keep track of, and some of the weaknesses in it, they certainly identify that more effort's needed on a lot of things. So I think if policymakers pay attention to this, they're going to have a stream of further updates to help take into account. But what should they take out of it? And I've got something that I think would be really useful for every jurisdiction to take out of this, which is that, as the authors note, every bit of emissions that we fail to reduce now or in the coming years increases our future reliance on CDR. And I think that's something that really needs to be front and centre for, like, we've had a lot of debates about targets and about, you know, the trajectory towards targets and how important it is or isn't if we achieve this or that bit of the target. And a lot of those debates sort of happen in a weird place. We don't have a lot of examination of the costs of failure most of the time. But also, there is this huge reliance for the 1.5 especially, but also for 2 degrees temperature goals. Like, they increasingly rely on global net negative emissions, and those involve like a new global industry as large as the global steel sector or the aluminium sector, which has only the product of taking carbon out of the atmosphere and sticking it somewhere permanent. It's more or less the only thing that industry will be selling, and who's going to be buying and where are they bearing the costs. When we're thinking about our own targets, we really need to be thinking about the carbon debt that we're incurring if they are not sufficiently aggressive or we don't meet them. And not carbon debt as a metaphor, but as a very real resource and financial liability that a lot of energy, like literal energy, will need to be poured into down the track to pay that debt off. I think, you know, bringing some budget discipline, fiscal budget discipline into these considerations would be really helpful, because we're currently in a situation where it's like pre-1980s budgeting, where you don't have the forward estimates really, and, you know, things that look great in year one just look great, even if they incur actually some pretty bad fiscal impacts in year 3 or 4 or beyond. So I think that we could get some good old-fashioned fiscal discipline into this whole climate game. That'd be great.
I think that framing is incredibly helpful on 2 fronts, because there's so much focus on the target, and I think this is what you were sort of driving at, Tennant, which is a point-in-time target. If we hit that point, it sort of doesn't matter what happens in between now and then. We've done it and job done. When in reality, the pathway we take to that target is incredibly important. The cumulative emissions that have been generated in the intervening 3 decades, incredibly important. And I don't think that's appreciated in the public debate. And so a little bit more literacy around, if we put it out there, at some point we might need to take it out again, is something that could be really, really helpful. And the idea of the cost actually not being some amorphous social cost of carbon, which nobody really understands, is saying perhaps we reach a point where if you're emitting carbon dioxide, you need to pay into a fund to cover its eventual removal from the atmosphere, the cost of carbon removal, and that is something which is built in, which obviously does 2 things. It means that, you know, there's a pool of money there to fund that activity in the future, but it also acts as a very clear incentive for those organisations to rapidly transition their own enterprises.
There isn't magic pixie dust waiting for us, you know, on the other side of 2050. Even just to your point about fiscal discipline and considering the cost of some of, you know, the interventions that we've covered here today in CDR, like, it's in the order now of hundreds to thousands of dollars a tonne of CO2. So, you know, and we've not costed the alternative to going further, faster on emissions reduction in the near term to save us that potentially enormous cost down the track, which isn't going to come down unless there's some form of investment as well in helping some of those technologies scale up. So it does also feel like for policymakers there is an analogous conversation as well about the role that Australia wants to play in supporting some or other of these CDR approaches to scale up, that like the way that ARENA was set up to do that for the renewables sector. It feels like something in that sort of scale of response might be necessary.
I think the very last thing I'd say on the policy front is this is yet another context where we need to remember we can't just do the stuff that is currently the cheapest. 15 years ago, people who were wrong, like me, said, oh, why bother with all this renewable energy stuff when you've got both cheap reforestation things, but also abatement available worldwide. Just have an ETS, don't need a RET. Well, I was a bit of an idiot. Because you do need to scale the stuff that is currently the cheapest and get huge volumes out of that, but you also need to bring additional technologies, additional options to deal with the rest of the economy or the rest of what you ultimately need to address for global net zero and net negative. You need to bring those things down the cost curve, and you do that by deploying them. Not by people with clipboards and white coats in a lab somewhere just kind of abstractly studying things. As important and wonderful as those people and those clipboards are.
Well, that goes back to the learning rates thing. It's actually getting stuff out into the field, right? Yep. That actually drives down the cost. And for some of these novel technologies, it's absolutely what we need to be doing, and that's got to be the focus of policy.
Indeed. People should read this report. That's my bottom line.
And we should get our ducks on.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Frankie, what have you got?
Well, last week I had an out-of-body experience. I took myself to the theatre with two very good friends of mine to see a limited run on The Picture of Dorian Gray, which had come back to Sydney after multiple sellout seasons here previously before going to Adelaide and then Melbourne, and it's about to go take the world by storm. And I'm still recovering from the experience. It was probably one of the best bits of theatre I've ever seen. So it was a one-woman show. So Erin Jean Norval is the person who plays all 26 characters of the novel, and this is an adaptation written by the Sydney Theatre Company's artistic director, Kip Williams. And so it's not just the feat of performance of Erin Jean Norval, it's also the way it incorporated technology into the performance. So it was a mix of live and then pre-recorded video as well. So you had Erin Jean Norval walking around the stage, changing costume as she goes, being followed by a cohort of people dressed in black who are variously filming her and then changing her costume at various points, and then screens that come down onto which pre-recorded video of her and other characters plays, and she interacts with live. So the whole thing is sequenced down to the second, and it was just brilliant. I have no other words for it. This is not at all a climate and energy related one more thing, but it was too good not to mention. And it's less of a public service announcement for all our listeners, because I don't believe there are any more shows happening.
You're tantalising people with something they can't experience.
I know, it's a little bit of a brag. It's like, if you haven't seen it, I think it might be too late. Unless you're planning to go to to London's West End or Broadway in New York sometime soon. But it's just a brilliant piece of Aussie theatre, really innovative. What a spectacular performance. And yeah, I can't shut up about it, including on here with you too. So it was great.
I'm glad you had a good night.
Also, I had a night out without my child. It was also very novel.
That is something to celebrate.
Yeah.
Tennant, what have you got?
So I'm going to mention a marginally relevant item, which is a computer game in which you can solve climate change at a global scale. This is a grand strategy hard science fiction game in early access on Steam called Terra Invicta. And you solve climate change as kind of a subplot, because the main plot is that you're fending off an alien invasion starting in late 2022. But in order to do that in a hard science fiction world, you've got to make quite a lot of fundamental breakthroughs in energy physics, in computing, in manufacturing, and you are operating in a reasonably detailed simulation of the world economy with some climate elements. You're making a whole bunch of trade-off decisions about going for maximum production versus the negative impacts that's going to have, including through the global levels of different greenhouse gases and also aerosols that are cooling the world. I think I may be giving the correct impression that this is an overly complex game, and it's one that is extremely drawn out. It takes about 40 or 50 hours to get to maybe past the midway point of an effort to defend the Earth. It's quite a lot. So, yeah, if juggling GHG levels in your global economy sounds like fun, and if having the right trade-offs between reactor power and heat radiator mass on your spaceships sounds like a laugh, then get into Terra Invicta. Save the world in multiple dimensions. I have to say, I don't think that climate people will... I think they'll have a few complaints about the way that climate technology is depicted in this game. Solar power is not very good unless you're in the orbit of Mercury. It's all about fusion. Maybe a bit of fission, but fusion.
How does direct air capture do in this scenario?
So I have not unlocked a direct air capture technology yet. Maybe this is a statement from the developers that they don't think the CDR people are very good. Like, I've got 500 gigawatt fusion reactors on my spaceships. Haven't cracked direct air capture yet.
Well, I guess it falls to me to just do a bog standard. Was vaguely on topic.
The most traditionalist and conservative of all of us, Luke. Go ahead.
Yes. Well, I was lucky enough to catch the second day of the annual Energy Consumers Australia foresighting forum last week, and I just wanted to say it was a delight to be in a room with a bunch of folk from all parts of the energy and climate movement, but in particular a bunch of consumer groups that are thinking through how they can make this transition work, which is always important, but is especially important given what we're seeing happen with energy bills, and notwithstanding some of the efforts late last year to take the edge off some of that, and it appears to be having some effect. It's still really tough out there. So shout out to Lynn and Kerry and our friends at ECA for pulling that together yet again. It was a good gig, and I should say that if you weren't there, there is always within a couple of weeks of the Foresighting Forum videos of all the sessions that are going up, so you can pick the eyes out of that in due course.
Love our friends at the ECA.
I've enjoyed that forum in past years, but I sadly could not make it this year.
That is our show for today. We're all on Twitter. Frankie is at
Frankie Muscovich.
Tennant is at
Tennant Reid.
My hell is at Luke Menzel. As I mentioned last episode, I'm also on Mastodon. You can find me at Luke Menzel at oz.social. If you have a report you'd like us to read, you could do what Philomena Bashara did and submit it by email at mailbag@letmesumup.net. Philomena suggested the CDR report we just chatted about. Thanks, Philomena. It was an absolute cracker. Never miss an episode by subscribing to Let Me Sum Up in your podcast app of choice. You'll find a fulsome back catalogue of episodes at letmesumup.net. But for Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon. I have no idea how long we talked for. I found the numbers jumping around all over the place was making it was completely disorienting.
Yes. Yes. I think the quest for a way of wrangling this will continue. That particular plugin doesn't do the job. Maybe we should invite special guest Bing Search
Clippy.
They yell at us
to participate in the next one.
I want to see the arc in development from Clippy to this bot. I don't think any of us wants to run off with Clippy, by the way.
Let's go with that. I'm certainly not going to admit to any dark desires for the most eligible of all personal digital assistants. There's no Clippy fan fiction in my repertoire, I promise you.